The orbital station floated like a silent giant above the gas planet below. Inside its cold metal walls, hundreds of species moved through shining corridors, most of them avoiding each other, speaking in low voices, walking in strict patterns. The rules on this station were not just written in books or on screens. They were spoken in glances and enforced with fear. One of the strongest of these rules was this: no one, under any reason, must ever touch a highborn Vari. The Vari were tall and pale-skinned, with glowing lines running along their arms and necks. Their eyes shimmered like cold stars, and their movements were slow, graceful, perfect. Among them, the Highborn were royalty. Untouchable, pure. The Vari believed any contact with a lesser being would poison the soul of the Highborn, and they carried this belief with pride. Most humans thought the rule was strange, even foolish, but they respected it because peace was better than war. Brian was a human technician. He wore a gray uniform, kept his head down, and worked hard. He was not a soldier or a leader. He was not brave or bold. He fixed wires and checked power systems and drank cheap coffee during short breaks. His life was quiet, simple, and full of repetition. He had never spoken to a Vari, much less looked one in the eyes. He did not want trouble. He only wanted to finish his shift and rest. That morning began like any other. A small alarm blinked on his tablet, showing a mild energy spike in a storage. Wing on level 6, he sighed, gathered his tools, and walked there with slow steps, expecting another overheated circuit or a broken fuse. When he reached the hallway, something felt wrong. The lights flickered too fast. The doors hissed and groaned. The air was thick and dry. He checked the readings. A surge was building behind the sealed doors. The chamber beyond was marked with red symbols. Vari symbols. Brian paused. This area was restricted. No human crew were assigned here. Still, the data showed an unstable charge was growing near the wall core. If it exploded, it would destroy part of the station. He called for help. No answer. He repeated the call. Nothing. His chest grew tight. Time was short. He opened the emergency panel and forced the door code. The door slid open, revealing a large round room lined with silver walls. In the center of the chamber, glowing panels sparked and cracked with rising energy. And lying just beside them was a Vari. She was tall, dressed in thin golden robes. Her silver hair spread out on the floor like water. Her eyes were closed. Her skin twitched with the static. Brian froze. His brain screamed at him to step back, to close the door, to run. Every training manual said never to touch a highborn. Never, even in danger. But she was not moving. And the energy core was seconds away from blowing. His hands trembled. His breath caught in his throat. He looked at her again. She was going to die. Without thinking, he ran to her side. The static shocked his legs, burning through his uniform. He knelt and placed his hand beneath her back, lifting her slowly, awkwardly. Her skin felt too smooth, too cold. Sparks danced around them. He carried her out of the room just before the core burst. A wave of heat rolled over them as the door slammed shut again. The alarm lights turned red. Emergency systems kicked in. Brian collapsed in the hallway, still holding her in his arms. She coughed once, then opened her eyes. They were bright, glowing with pale blue light. She stared at him without a word. Then other sounds came, running boots, shouting voices. Station guards arrived, both human and Vari, weapons ready. The moment they saw Brian holding her, they stopped. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. A Vari soldier stepped forward, eyes wide with horror. He spoke in his language, fast and angry. The other guards rushed forward and pulled Brian away. He tried to explain. He pointed at the room. He said the core was going to explode, that she would have died. No one listened. He was dragged away, locked in a small white room with no windows and no clock. Hours passed, maybe days. He did not know. His hands still felt the weight of her body. Her skin had left a strange mark on his palm, not a burn, not a scar. Just a faint trace, like a memory refusing to fade. Eventually, a human officer came. To speak to him, her face was hard, her voice was low. She said the Vari were furious. The Highborn he had touched was an ambassador. An important one. His action had dishonored her. They wanted him turned over. Judged, punished, maybe executed. The humans were trying to calm the Vari, but nothing was certain. Brian leaned back. In the chair, his head throbbed. He asked if she survived. The officer nodded. He nodded too. That was enough. He had saved a life, even if it ended his own. Outside the holding cell, rumors spread. Some called him foolish. Others called him brave. A few whispered that maybe the rule was just fear in disguise. But no one spoke loud enough to be heard. Inside his cell, Brian sat in silence. He was not a hero. He was not a rebel. He was just someone who saw another person in danger and chose not to look away. But out there, the storm was only beginning. The walls of the holding cell were made of smooth silver panels that reflected Brian's tired face in fragments. There was no bed, no window, no sound except the low hum of recycled air moving through hidden vents. Time passed without rhythm. He did not know whether it was morning or night, whether minutes were crawling or hours slipping past like shadows. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall and stared at nothing. His mind was full of silent questions. Why was this happening so fast? How had a simple action, one human choice to help another, turned into a crime that threatened everything? He had not spoken to anyone since the officer left. No visitors came, no messages arrived. Food trays appeared through a small opening and disappeared again without a word. The silence pressed down on him. But regret was louder than silence. It whispered inside his chest. Not regret for touching the Highborn. He would do it again. Regret for what followed. For the damage. For the isolation. For the way people now looked at him as if he had broken something sacred. Brian remembered the eyes of the other workers on the station. Before this incident, they would nod to him in the corridors, share tools and small jokes, speak kindly during long shifts. Now they avoided his gaze. Some looked angry. Others looked afraid. When they passed his name in whispers, they did not speak with respect. They spoke like he was cursed, like he had brought shame to the whole human crew. Even the ones who secretly admired what he did remained silent. No one wanted to stand too close to the center of trouble. In the meeting rooms beyond his cell, the station leaders were under pressure. The Vari delegation was threatening to cut diplomatic ties. They said the touch of a human had destroyed the spiritual purity of their Highborn ambassador. They demanded that Brian be handed over to them for cultural justice. No one outside their caste system knew what that meant. Some guessed it would involve isolation. Others believed it would be public punishment. A few feared it would mean death. The human commanders tried to calm the situation. They spoke of the emergency. They explained how Brian had saved a life, but the Vari refused to listen. Their law was clear. The crime was not about intention. It was about touch. No outsider could ever lay a hand on a Highborn, no matter the reason. Forgiveness was not part of the equation. Brian sat in his cell and tried to remember the moment again. He thought about her face. Not her glowing eyes or fine robes or alien skin. He remembered her silence. The stillness in her body, the way she had stopped breathing. That was all he had seen. A life about to vanish. And his body had moved before. His mind, he had not made a choice. He had acted because it felt right. But now everything around him seemed wrong. One evening, or maybe it was morning, the silence broke. A soft beep echoed through the room. His tablet lit up. A message waited. He touched the screen. The words were short. They read, "Why did you save me? He stared at the message, heart beating faster. The sender was listed only as private channel, but he knew it had to be her. The ambassador, the one he had touched. The one they now called ruined. He tapped out his reply slowly. Because you were dying. Because no one else was there. Because I could. There was no response for a long time. Then another message appeared. You broke a sacred law. Do you understand what that means to my people? He thought carefully. Yes, but I also understand what it means to let someone die when you can stop a dot after that. No more words came that day. He placed the tablet aside and closed his eyes. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from the weight of everything. The silence returned, but it was not empty now. It carried something new, a connection, a thread between two minds. The next day, another message appeared. You are not like the others. Brian smiled for the first time in days. He replied, maybe I am, or maybe you only met the wrong ones. Later, another message came. I have been taught all my life that humans act only for gain, that your kind would never take risk unless reward was near. Yet you took the greatest risk and asked for nothing. Replied, I didn't need a reward. I needed you to live. That night, she sent no more words. But Brian felt something shift. The wall between them was thin now. And on the other side, a mind was questioning everything it once believed. Outside the cell, things were growing tense. News of the incident had spread far. On human forums and message boards, some called Brian a hero. Others feared he had endangered the peace between species. Vari groups on the station protested, demanded separation. Some even said all humans should be relocated to avoid further contamination of their sacred caste. The line between justice and anger was thinning. One wrong word could spark violence. Inside a hidden room near the central garden of the station, the Highborn ambassador now sat alone. Her name was not spoken often anymore. Her guards had been removed. Her robes replaced with simple cloth. The glow on her arms had faded. She was no longer welcomed by her people. To them, she was touched, tainted. Even though she still lived, she had been erased from their memory. Yet her mind was more awake than ever. She watched the same messages on her own screen. Brian's words echoed in her thoughts. They were simple words but heavy with meaning. No title, no honor. Just a life that saw another in danger and reached forward. She wondered if courage always looked so plain on the outside. She wondered if the rules she had followed were only walls to keep truth from entering. And she wondered what would happen if she met him again, not as a prisoner, not as a victim, but as someone seeking truth. The station above the gas giant had grown colder over the days since the incident. Not in temperature, but in the way people moved and spoke and looked at one another. Whispers replaced greetings, and silence filled the air where once there had been calm duty. Human workers walked with their heads low while Vari patrols doubled in number. Tension moved like smoke through every hallway and chamber. Brian remained inside his cell while messages from the ambassador had become the only light in his dark space. Her words were different now, less formal, more curious. She no longer asked why he did it. She had accepted that part. Now she asked how humans lived, what values they held, whether emotion mattered more than logic, whether a life could be measured in action or in status. Brian answered with honesty. He told her about small things like the warmth of sunlight on skin or the way humans mourned, those they lost, or how music could carry the weight of pain and hope in the same note. She did not always understand, but she listened and she asked more. And her questions grew deeper. Then one evening after many silent hours, his door opened without warning. For a moment he thought it was the end, that the Vari had come to take him away and pass judgment. But instead, an old man stepped inside dressed in a gray officer's uniform with heavy boots and tired eyes. He looked at Brian with a face that Held no fear, only weariness and something else that felt like memory. The man introduced himself as Commander Raynor. He had been on this station since before the first treaty with the Vari. He had seen peace built and almost broken many times. He sat beside Brian on the floor without asking and spoke slowly. He said he had been watching the situation and reading the messages that passed through the monitored channels. He said he believed Brian had not broken anything, but instead had opened something that no one was ready to face. He spoke of the Vari and their laws, how their caste system was older than human cities, how touch was used as a tool of control, not purity. He said there were quiet whispers among the younger Vari, who had begun to question the Highborn rules. But fear silenced most of them. And now with Brian's act, the fear had returned sharper than ever. Brian listened without speaking much. He had no strength for long words. He only asked one question. What happens now? The commander paused before answering. He said the council was still divided. Some wanted to hand Brian over to save the fragile alliance. Others feared it would break the trust of their own people. But there was one voice missing from the argument. The ambassador herself. No one had heard her speak since the incident. Brian nodded. He felt the weight of that silence more than anything. Same night, while Brian slept on the cold floor of his cell, the ambassador moved through the quiet halls of the Vari wing, dressed in plain clothes, her face hidden beneath a dark hood. Her name was no longer spoken aloud among her people. They called her the broken one, the touched one, the one who should not be seen. But her heart burned with questions, and her mind refused to stay quiet. She reached a side corridor and used an old passcode to enter the human wing. A few guards gave her strange looks but said nothing. She was no longer of rank. She was no longer a threat. She stood before Brian's cell and waited for the door to open. When it did, she stepped inside without sound. Brian rose to his feet, slowly unsure if this was a dream or a trick of the mind. But it was her, the same eyes, the same calm presence. But something had changed in the way she stood. Her spine was straighter. Her hands did not shake. They did not speak right away. Words would only slow what they already knew. She sat across from him and looked into his eyes. For the first time since the touch, there was no anger, no fear, no shame. Only a deep curiosity that reached beyond rules and history. She told him she had been raised to see humans as wild and weak, taught that emotions were flaws and contact was poison. She said his action had destroyed that belief like fire melting glass. He had risked his life for her with nothing to gain. He had touched her not to control or claim but to save, Brian told her. He had seen fear in her eyes that day, not pride or power. Just the simple fear of dying alone. He said no rule should stop someone from reaching out in that moment. They spoke for hours inside the silent cell. She asked about Earth and how children are raised and whether humans believed in destiny. He asked about her caste and how truth is measured and whether she had ever doubted the teachings of her people. Their voices moved like water over stones. Soft but strong. She revealed a secret then. Something hidden for generations among the Highborn, a truth never told to outsiders. She said the caste purity was not natural. It had been created long ago through manipulation and control. The Highborn were not more powerful or pure. They were born with a lie written into their blood. She had proof, files, records, biological data. If this truth came to light, the entire Vari order would collapse. The touch was never dangerous. It was never fatal. It was only forbidden to maintain power. Brian sat in stunned silence as she spoke. Not because the truth shocked him, but because she trusted him enough to share it. Then she stood and said she would not run anymore. She would speak. She would expose the lie. But she would need help. And it would cost both of them everything. Before she left, she placed her hand on his shoulder. This time not to be saved, but to show that the wall between them was gone. She walked out of the cell and disappeared into the shadows of the station. Once again, Brian watched the door close behind. Huron knew the fight was no longer about one touch. It was about what followed, the truth, the courage, the change, and it had only just begun. The station no longer felt like a place of peace. It had become a stage for something deeper, something heavier than diplomacy or law. People moved differently. Now slower, quieter, avoiding each other, as if the truth whispered behind their backs. The touch between a human and a highborn Vari had started it, but what followed had turned into a fire waiting for air. Every corridor hummed with tension, every room held eyes that watched from corners. Brian had been moved from his cell to a private room under the watch of only one human guard. The old commander had done what he could to protect him while the storm outside thickened. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew that time was running out. The Vari were demanding a final decision. Either Brian would be released into their hands, or they would cut ties with human forces and leave the station. That alone would not be the end. It would be the start of something far worse. Trade would stop. Talks would fall. Borders would close. Old wounds between species would open again. And none of it could be taken back. Inside the room, Brian waited. He ate in silence. He slept in short hours. He thought of the ambassador and the last words they shared. She had promised to reveal the truth. He believed her. But belief did not stop fear from growing. He knew what the Vari were capable of when order was challenged. He had seen the way they turned their eyes away from her, as if she had become invisible. If she stood against them, she would not just lose her name. She might lose her life. Then one evening the lights flickered low. A signal. The door opened not with the step of a guard, but the quiet stride of the ambassador herself. She wore the same dark robe, and her eyes were calm but alert. She moved like a shadow between the guards and scanners. She knew the station better than anyone. Brian stood and followed her without a word. There was no need for long explanations. This was the moment. They were not going to wait for permission. They were going to move. Through hidden tunnels and maintenance shafts they moved like smoke. The ambassador led with steady steps. She had once walked these same halls with guards at her side and crowds lowering their heads in respect. Now she moved unseen through the veins of the station as one of the forgotten. The fall from power had stripped her of titles but given her something else, something stronger than honor. She had nothing left to lose, and that gave her freedom. They reached a control room near the docking bay. The commander waited there, face grim, eyes tired. He handed Brian a small device and nodded once. It was a clearance code for one of the old transport ships. He said it would only give them minutes to launch before the system locked down. Brian thanked him with a look. There was no time for more. Then alarms began to wail across the station. The Vari had found out. Voices rose over the comms, demanding shutdown orders and security alerts. The halls flashed red as lockdown protocols started. Doors slammed shut. Energy shields locked the main corridors. The station was going into full containment, but the ambassador was already moving. She pulled Brian toward the lower bay, a path known only to her. They passed through old access doors once used for cargo, now forgotten by most. The commander had bought them seconds with false signals and scrambled codes. But seconds were all. They would get at the bay. They reached the ship. A small gray shuttle marked with human letters. It had no weapons, only speed and stealth. Brian rushed to the controls and began startup while the ambassador moved to the rear console. She uploaded the files, the truth, the evidence, records of the genetic designs used to shape the Highborn, data proving that touch had no divine effect, that the cast was a wall built from lies. The ship lifted just as station guards reached the docking tunnel. Energy blasts struck the side. Sparks flew. Brian gritted his teeth and pulled the lever. The ship tore away from the station, spinning into open space. But they were not safe yet. The Vari ships were already moving. Sleek and silver, they surrounded the escape path like sharks. In water, warnings filled the screen, demands to return, threats of fire. Brian turned to the ambassador. Her eyes were fixed on the screen. She did not blink. She tapped a final command. A transmission burst from their ship, sent across all frequencies. The files were out now. Not just to humans, not just to the Vari. To everyone. The silence that followed was heavier than sound. In the very command ship, a council of elders watched the data unfold. Their faces turned pale, their lips tight. One of them whispered something none of them had ever said aloud. The cast is a lie. In the station control room, human and Vari officials stared at screens filled with truth. The ambassador's voice came through steady and clear. She said she had been touched not in body, but in thought. That a single moment had broken years of silence inside her. That the truth had always been hidden, but not anymore. On board the shuttle, Brian and the ambassador sat side by side. The Vari ships began to slow. Their weapons dimmed. The chase had stopped. The damage had been done, but so had the healing. Something had cracked, and light was leaking through. The ambassador closed her eyes for a moment, then looked at Brian. She said it was not just his hand that had changed her. It was the choice behind it. The choice to break a rule for the sake of life. And now she had broken a rule too. For the same reason. Their ship moved through the dark toward the edge of neutral space. Behind them, the station was silent. Before them, the stars stretched wide and open. What lay ahead was unknown. But what they left behind could never be the same. The stars stretched endlessly ahead as the shuttle glided through the silence of deep space. Behind them, the station had vanished into the black, its lights shrinking until they became just another distant point among thousands. Brian sat at the controls, his hands steady, his eyes watching the screen for any sign of pursuit, but none came. The Vari ships that had once circled the station like blades of judgment now floated without motion, uncertain of their orders, uncertain of their beliefs. Beside him, the ambassador remained quiet, her eyes fixed on the star lines forming through the glass. Her name had once been spoken with great respect across diplomatic channels and broadcast halls. Now it was erased from official records. To her people, she no longer existed. But within her, the fire had not gone out. It had only changed shape. They did not speak for a long time as the ship moved beyond known patrol lines into the borderless region between human and Vari space. The messages continued to spread. Their broadcast had not been stopped. The truth had landed across hundreds of ships and stations, carried by simple signals and quiet mouths. Many ignored it, some denied it, but a few had started to listen. Inside, the Vari Council's debate had turned to silence. The younger voices among them had begun asking old questions. Why were they told that touch would corrupt when there was no sign of sickness? Why were only the Highborn allowed access to truth? Why had one human saved an ambassador at the cost of his own freedom when he had no reason to care? Some elders tried to tighten control. They spoke of tradition and survival. They called the ambassador a traitor. They claimed the files were fake, but the cracks had already formed. And cracks always spread. On Earth, the response was different. Human media turned the story into a storm. Images of Brian saving the ambassador were shared across screens. Writers called him a symbol of unity. Protesters called him a fool. Children asked their parents if it was always wrong to break a rule to do the right thing. Political leaders chose their words carefully, but the people chose more freely. Brian had become a name not just in reports, but in conversations across cities and homes. And yet Brian himself did not care for fame. He only wanted peace. Not between species, but within himself. He wanted to believe that his action had meaning, not just noise. After several days in space, the shuttle reached a research outpost near the edge of human territory. The crew there welcomed them with quiet respect. They offered food and rest. No one asked too many questions. The ambassador wore a hood and moved among them without title. She spoke softly when she did speak. Brian noticed how she touched things. Now, walls, chairs, plants, as if learning the world again through contact. One night she came to Brian with a message in hand, a reply from the station. The commander had sent it in secret. It said the station was calm now, that no war had started, that voices were rising on both sides demanding change. The message ended with 5 simple words: "You were right to touch." Brian read it again and again, not for pride, for peace. Then the ambassador told him she would return, not to power, not to the council, but to the people. She would speak directly. She would walk among the ones who had never been allowed to ask questions. She would not hide anymore. Brian wanted to argue. He feared for her, but he saw the resolve in her eyes and understood. She had touched truth, and once touched it could not be ignored. They said goodbye at the edge of the outpost landing deck. The shuttle that would take her back was small but fast. She wore simple clothing now, no robe, no crown. But when she walked, there was strength in her step. Brian stood watching as the shuttle rose into the black sky. He knew he might never see her again, but something inside him had changed. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, deep way, like a new root pushing into earth. Weeks passed. Then months, and slowly the world changed. The Vari caste law was not erased overnight, but its grip weakened. Protests began in hidden spaces, then moved into open gatherings. Young Vari citizens stood side by side with workers and asked why purity required blindness. Medical records once locked away were released. The words of the ambassador were studied in learning halls. Her choice to return and speak became a symbol of courage. On the human side, new laws were written to protect those who acted in defense of life, even across species lines. Brian was offered awards and titles, but he refused them. He returned to a quiet life in a smaller station, far from the center. He fixed machines and cleaned systems. He drank coffee and shared jokes with new workers. But people knew his story, and sometimes they would ask him what made him act. He always gave the same answer: because I could not walk away. One day a message came. Short and simple. From her. We are rebuilding. Without the cast. Without lies. You were not alone. He read it and smiled. Not because it was grand. Because it was real. In the end, it had not been about laws or bloodlines. Not about rules or power. It had been about a single human choice made in the quiet moment between life and death. To reach out. To touch. And everything after had followed like the turning of a great wheel. A touch that broke a law. A law that had no truth. And a truth that could no longer be silenced. That was how change began. Not with a weapon, but with a hand. The end.